All right. Hey guys, good evening and welcome to the NT Podcast, channel about science and theology. I'm your host, Nemanja Jurišić, and today we are here again with our main guest on our channel, Dr. Richard Hess, professor of Hebrew, Semitic languages, and the Old Testament. So, Professor Rick, welcome. How is it going?
Thank you. It's very good to be here, and it's great to see you again.
Oh, thank you so much. It is also great opportunity to see you. So we discussed a little previously. You were really busy and have some papers and work. So nice. And so finally, some free time for our interview. Before we start, let me remind our audience to follow our channel and in the description of the video there is a link of your website, oldtestamentquestions.com. So many interesting short articles for those who love biblical theology, Semitic languages, archaeology, etc. So today's topic is about the book of Esther. Dr. Hess, are the events in the book of Esther historically valid? Can you tell us more about the characters in this book and historical context, archaeology, or anything else that would help us gain a deeper insight?
Yes, well, of course, the Book of Esther is set in the time of the Persian Empire, and it is set at a period that usually ascribes the official name of the king, who is presented as Ahasuerus in the Book of Esther, as the better known, especially through Greek classical historical sources, as Xerxes. And Xerxes begins his reign about 486 BC, and shortly after that, we read in Esther of a banquet that takes place. And he has a banquet in anticipation of his time of going and attacking the Greeks, which takes place at the early on in his rule in the 480s, at the end of that decade, and then 484 and 479, and he's trying to bring together all of his Persian armies to go against the Greeks. And it may be in this context that the banquet takes place, in which Vashti is asked to come and appear and refuses to do so. Now, the main sources, we don't really have that many historical sources from this period, especially from the Persians themselves. There are perhaps 21 or so royal inscriptions of any sort, and of these, most of these are simply copies that Xerxes copied from his father Darius, and don't really tell us much in the way of new information, maybe put his own name there. The additional records we have from Persia, and especially the country to the south of Persia, Elam, and elsewhere, are almost all economic records. That is, they are receipts and other things. So they give us some names and of individuals, including names of people. At least the elements of those names are represented in the Book of Esther, so it's not unknown. But they don't tell us much about the historical events taking place, which is what Esther is, of course, interested in, with Xerxes and the palace and everything there. But again, with regards to this banquet, it is possible that there could have been such a banquet, or at least such a celebration or event, which was really designed perhaps to recruit the armies that Xerxes wanted as he moved forward to attacking Greece, which was one of his main goals there in his early years of reign. The figure of Vashti is a figure who, if she is related to the known queen from the Greek sources, would be Amestris. Amestris was said to have been, at least before the Persian invasion of Greece, the wife of Xerxes. And she she's known from, as I say, the Greek sources. And again, when we come to the Greek sources, we're mainly dealing with Herodotus, who is concerned about the Persian invasion of Greece and not a whole lot about what happens after that. So there is a limit in terms of the information there. This is really true also of the other the playwrights, Aeschylus and others who mention the Persians, Theseus, who also speaks of the Persians at a later time, and also himself may have some distortions because of the later period that he's writing in. But Vashti is not the same as the name Amestris. However, it's possible that there was another queen involved, or perhaps even more likely, that Vashti is not the personal name of the queen, but is related to a similar sounding Old Persian term for beautiful woman. If so, then that could either be a description or a title of the figure we know of as Vashti. And that may be what is preserved for us with regards to her identification. The figure of Esther is not otherwise known or recorded, but again, as I say, she really doesn't emerge until after Xerxes defeats, and he comes back to his palace. The so-called beauty pageant that takes place then and the other events happen in the years following that. And that is even witnessed to in Esther 3:7, which makes that claim, I believe, sometime around the 12th year or so of Xerxes in the late 470s, maybe 473 or something about that time in terms of the year. Again, as we look at with regards to the figure of Esther, we do see the name Mordecai, and again, some of the other officials we find mentioned names like that in the receipts and so forth. That doesn't mean they are the same people. There are many people with the name of Mordecai because it's related to the Babylonian god Marduk. And that would be a popular name that would have been used perhaps by itself, or with a suffix, as Mordecai may have had on the end of it, or with an additional epithet as to Marduk being a particular good or great god or something like this. So Mordecai is not by any means an unknown name, and it's possible there are officials mentioned with that name in Xerxes' administration. We just don't know much more about the figure outside of the book of Esther. There are attempts to relate Mordecai again in Esther chapter 3. He is introduced, and there he is described as a figure, and his lineage is given, tracing him back to Kish. And of course, Kish is connected with Saul, the first king of Israel, who fights, and ultimately, while he defeats the Amalekites, he is, in a sense, condemned by Samuel and loses his kingship because he fails to kill and destroy the king of the Amalekites before Samuel shows up. But his nemesis in the story of Esther is, of course, Haman, who is also related back to and is identified as an Amalekite. So in a sense, what Saul failed to do, his later heir in the form of Mordecai succeeds in doing in defeating the descendant of the Amalekites of that era. But it's in that context that in chapter 3, I think around verse 15, that Mordecai is connected with the return from exile under Jehoiakim and others. And so some want to say, well, this is a chronological impossibility. Mordecai would have had to have been something like 123 years of age if he came back in 5 39, and even went into exile with Jehoiakim earlier, before 586 BC, and then comes back at this time more than a century later. But if you read that carefully, and in the Hebrew, the text certainly allows for, and in the context even would seem to suggest, that it's not so much Mordecai who is seen as going into exile as his lineage, his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, who are listed there. And it is that lineage which is then traced back to Saul and Kish. And so there's an importance to connecting that lineage, because they want to contrast Mordecai, the Jew and Israelite, with Haman, the Amalekite. And so that I think is not so much of a problem as some would want to make it. Otherwise, the lavish gifts that are given in Esther by the king, his ability to do this, and the fact that he does do it, are in fact attested in the earlier sources that we have from Herodotus, especially. There is also the issue that some note of the 129 states or provinces that are mentioned as part of
127, right?
127. Thank you. Yeah, my mistake. 127 states or provinces that are mentioned, and the fact that the Persian Empire, as known at this time, is only divided into 25 or 35 satrapies. Now, these provinces are never called satrapies in the book of Esther, and they may well represent a different administrative division. After all, the Persian Empire was the largest empire known in history up to that point. And so it would have been huge, and it's not at all impossible that many subsections of satrapies could have existed, and did no doubt exist. In fact, in chapter 3 and later in the book of Esther, it mentions both satraps, leaders of the satrapies, and also governors of the provinces. So it sees those as two distinct and different leadership groups. And I think that helps us to understand that what we have here is not simply a contradiction where the writers of Esther did not understand the divisions and administration of the Persian Empire, but they were looking at it from a different perspective and looking at these provinces. So those, I think, are some of the major issues that arise with regards to the historical understanding of the book of Esther. Esther, I believe, fits very well into the context of the 5th century BC, and particularly the early part in the time of Xerxes, and it gives us an understanding of a figure like Esther, who I believe is portrayed not as a weak sort of individual, not capable and just submissive to Xerxes, but rather as a strong individual who is even willing to risk her life in coming before Xerxes. And that, by the way, also seems to be an understanding of the way the Persian king governed, and you did not simply come into his presence. He had a number of officials who were eunuchs, who you arranged an appointment through in order to see him. So Esther appearing in this way was indeed risking her life. But the fact that the king should recognize her and then should respond to her as he did seems to me to all reflect both on her courage and on her skill in understanding something of the psychology and nature of the Persian ruler. So it is a wonderful account of bravery and of faithfulness, and of the way in which Israel was in fact delivered, or the Jews were delivered at this time. And of course, it is remembered in that biblical feast, the latest of the ones mentioned in the Old Testament, the biblical feast of Purim, that is still celebrated today in the early part of the calendar year, usually around February or March.
Right. Some say that Purim is the main reason why Book of Esther is written. So, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I suspect that many people identify with Esther through the Feast of Purim, and of course it's read at that time and remembered. But I think that Purim, as it appears in the book of Esther, comes at the very end and is more of a memento or symbol of a larger sense in which we see a figure like Esther and celebrate her courage and bravery at being faithful to God in the midst of a potential threat to her survival and the survival of the people of the Jewish people, which is, I think, another theme, the idea that despite all the machinations of people like Haman and others to bring about the destruction of the Jews, they survive. And there is this wonderful elusive comment that Mordecai makes to Esther when he is encouraging her to indeed even risk her life, and the fasting that takes place among the two of them and among all the people in the time before she comes before the king, and the prayers that are given at that time. But he also says to her that if she does not do this, help will come from another source, from another place. And this is the closest we get to a direct reference to God in the book of Esther, because otherwise God is not explicitly mentioned, but certainly figures like Mordecai and Esther believe in God, and their faith to him is what strengthens and encourages them through his grace to enable them to face the challenge. So I see it as part of a greater picture. And the poor, or the plural is Purim, as the festival is called, are the dice that are thrown. And as that takes place, and as the games that are played as a result of that take place, it's part of a celebration and a remembrance of how God provided for deliverance, which many of the festivals are. You go back to the festival of the Passover, and of course, that is God's deliverance of his people from slavery in Egypt and from the threatened extermination by Pharaoh's army at the Red Sea. So this would not be at all unexpected that such a festival would come out of this, but that's only part of the picture. There's a greater theme there.
Okay, amazing. Some say that the decree allowing Jews to defend themselves and slaughter their enemies is not in line with Persian administrative practices or the tolerance typically associated with Persian rule. Additionally, the number of people killed is extensive. I believe 70,000 people, and such a war is not mentioned in history. How you respond on this one?
Well, I don't think it was a war. I think it was, as I say, a survival means for the Jews to live and survive in the midst of what was a buildup. Because remember, the decree had already been promulgated and was out there that indeed the Jews would be killed or could be killed at this time, indeed should be. So particularly those who were their enemies and others, were no doubt already in a position to plan and to begin to enact this. We don't know if even some were imprisoned or in other cases. Remember that the Persian Empire was a huge empire, spanning what is today from west in Turkey over into what is today Iran, and perhaps even beyond, farther east into parts of Afghanistan. We don't know, but it certainly was a huge empire that included millions of people, and Herodotus and others speak of a million-man army that moves across from the Persian lands to attack Greece. Now, we don't know if it was that large. He may be exaggerating, but the fact that he could use a term like that suggests that there was a huge number of people in the empire. So I would only say that this idea that the Jews would defend themselves against their enemies who were out to kill them, is not impossible. It seems to me that the numbering is indeed within the realm of possibility, given the size and vastness of the empire, and any attempt to set a population at that time can only be a guess, an estimate. We don't know how many millions of people lived there. I'm just giving you some of the figures that we do have. And yeah, so I think it is possible. I think it was, as we say, a survival, and I think it took place at a time when we don't have annals. There are no annals from this period of Xerxes' rule. In fact, we have no historical annals at all from Xerxes. As I say, what most we have are these 21 or so records, of which most are simple copies from his father Darius and tell us no historical information, and the rest don't provide a lot, and certainly virtually nothing after the Greek wars after 479 BC. So this took place years after that, and I'm not surprised in one sense that we don't have records outside of the biblical account. It could have taken place, is the best we can say from extra-biblical evidence.
Correct. Thank you, Dr. Hess. And what about names? Let's say, Esther is connected to the name Ishtar. So can you explain that? And also, do other names like Haman, Mordecai, Haman, Ahasuerus, or others, does those names fit in the period of 5th century BC?
Yeah, they actually do. And some of the names of different figures, Haman, I'm not so much sure of, but certainly Mordecai, I mentioned. There are many examples of Mordecai. Esther probably comes and is related to the goddess Ishtar. And there certainly were a lot of women who may well have borne that name. That, of course, would be her Persian her Persian name, and not her Hebrew name, which she also seems to have had as well. And so I think there's a number of different things going on. You have this in the book of Daniel as well, where you see in the Babylonian and then later in the Persian period, you see figures who are named, both given a Hebrew name, but also given a Babylonian or Persian name. And that enables the Persians, it's part of their, and Babylonians before them, it's part of their control of the population and identifying them with their kingdom and with their empire. And I think that's certainly what we have here.
Awesome. And about festival, some say that that's exaggeration because 180 days is too much. Also, selection of Esther in a beauty context, is that even real? And the last one is about 127 satrapies or provinces or whatever. They seem like a symbolic number because 120 plus 7. It seems symbolic, right? Daniel 6:1 mentioned 120 in the time of Darius. So, yeah, explain all this.
Well, I tried to address some of those a bit earlier. The lengthy festival, I think, was part of a. I'm not sure that every day there was nothing but festival for everybody who attended, but I do think that there was an ongoing attempt to solicit people and engagement of different forces and armies from around the empire that would come together and form this huge army that moved westward to attack Greece. So the idea of a time of celebration, a time of bringing together, and maybe different parts of the empire during different parts of those days that would come to celebrate with the king, and then with that would be a pledge of troops and of engagement and of involvement. I think that that is within the realm of possibility as part of this larger picture. I think the sense of there being 127 provinces. This is, look, the change in the number of provinces or states could easily have taken place between the time of Daniel, if we consider that, and 100 years after that. You might well expect that each of these leaders, and particularly as we move from the period of a figure like Cyrus, who was uh, who was seen as a liberator and a conqueror coming to remove the taxation that had been placed upon the people by the Babylonians, and that kind of oppressive attitude. And then as a liberator comes in, and we don't know about taxation at that time, but what we do know, I mean, in the early years of Cyrus, there certainly were gifts brought. But it's an interesting period which we don't know a whole lot about outside of the Bible because, again, we don't have a lot of records.
And
Uh,
beauty context, some say that
yeah,
maybe king were using those queens in bed, not just beauty context. And is it
yeah.
yeah, way to find queen?
Well, uh, I think that that certainly is part of the picture, consistent also with what we know of rulers and leaders of these imperial powers. I don't think they use. I don't think they respected people maybe in the same way that we might think of, and that they were in fact using people. And I think part of that was that they looked for the most attractive women. Indeed, they looked for attractive men too. If you go back to Daniel 1, the idea that the those who would appear before the king should be full, bright and looking good and everything else. Um, and the same way then with the women who would come and who would be the wife of the king. This is not, I mean, I don't want to suggest that that's the only purpose that leaders have ever had, but it certainly is consistent with autocrats, dictators, and even other people that they should have as a leader, they should have their pick, as it were, of the most beautiful women. And certainly the Roman emperors, if you read Suetonius and others, that is certainly part of the picture that we have of figures like Tiberius and later successors to him in terms of what they did and what was involved. So uh, I don't think the Book of Esther condones this, and there are people, and I think not inaccurately, who speak of Esther as a sex slave. And I think that has a legitimacy to it to describe it that way. But we must also understand that she functioned or lived out faithfully within the role that she had, and that enabled her to do great things for God. So we work within a world which is no longer a world that is dedicated to God and in which the sovereigns and leaders are those who are in covenant relationship with God, but in fact of figures who have various aspects, are seen in various ways as compromised, as worshiping other gods and goddesses, as not interested in morality in the way which either we might understand it, or certainly the way the Bible would present it, for in the laws of the Pentateuch and elsewhere. So I think we have to understand that this is the picture. And again, I would say that while we don't have a specific example of a beauty contest or pageant being presented here in other sources for the time of Xerxes, it certainly is consistent with what we know of empires and the way in which a figure like Xerxes may have acted.